I'm John Tierman. I'm Executive Director of the Center for International Studies, and I welcome you. Before we get to our guests today, I want to alert you to some upcoming events that we're sponsoring. One is on the 13th, which is Wednesday. I've lost track of what day it is. The 13th is Wednesday at 4:30, a book talk, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. This is Miko Peled, and it should be really interesting. He's doing a tour related to his book. He'll be a provocative talker. That's at 4:30 in Bartos Theater, E15. On March 14th at 4:30, another book talk also about the Middle East. This is Shireen Al-Feki, Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World. That should be quite interesting. That's in E51 in Wong Auditorium. On the 15th, we have, those are both Starr Forums, which sponsors many of our talks. This will be, on the 15th, a separate event on the African diaspora at 11:32. Very interesting panels about the ebb and flow of Africans, and that's at 11:30 in the Media Lab, 6th floor of the Media Lab. Includes lunch. And then on April 12th, in the Bartos Theater, On the Rocks, China and Japan in the East China Sea. This is an emerging dispute over a number of issues related to resources, sovereignty, other things. Professor Richard Samuels will be chairing, Taylor Fravel, Yukio Okamoto, and others will be discussing sort of a roundtable on the South China Sea. That's April 12th. Today, we have two familiar experts on Iran. Both of them have been, I think, remarkably consistent and insightful voices in a more did I do that? No. In a more sensible policy toward Iran. First, our out-of-town guest, Barbara Slavin, is a longtime journalist. I can't even list all the publications that you've worked for, but is now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and writes for this very interesting website, Al Monitor, which covers issues of Iran and the broader Middle East. A lot of interesting people contribute to it, and I recommend it. It's actually, that's a picture from it. It was a picture from it. And Jim Walsh, our own Jim Walsh in the Security Studies program here, who has been working on nuclear issues pertaining to Iran now for several years, visits Iran sort of regularly, but not since 2009. Has made some of the most innovative proposals about resolving the nuclear standoff, and is as we all know, a CNN superstar. So it's always good to have a superstar with us. They're going to speak, each of them, for about 10 minutes. Just really tee us up, and then we're going to have a broader discussion between them and with you asking questions up here. So join me in welcoming first Barbara Slavin.
You can take it out if you want. I don't know.
No, it's not showing it on the screen. It's only showing it on the, which is odd.
Video card issue.
Don't worry about it. Can you actually move it aside for me? Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, John, for inviting me back. I think the last time I was here, I had a book that came out about the US and Iran, and I remember being very nervous because it's called Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, and the subtitle was Iran, the US, and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. And I was terrified that something was going to happen that would suddenly improve US-Iran relations dramatically, and the book title would immediately be out of date, and the whole story would be out of date. But that's back in 2007, 2008, and I've learned since then that it's naive to expect any kind of breakthroughs in US-Iran relations. You know the old phrase that failure is an orphan and success has 1,000 fathers. In the case of Iran, it's the reverse. Success is an orphan and failure has 1,000 fathers. There have been so many efforts made by so many good-willed people, Iranian, American, Brazilian, Turkish, Norwegian, to try to improve relations, and yet we never seem to get very far. Certainly a lot of Americans have gone. Jim Walsh has gone. I've gone to Iran now 8 times. I hope to go back again in June for their presidential elections. But my efforts at peace building, I don't think have been terribly successful, at least judging from where we are in terms of our lack of relations with Iran. But this is a good time to talk about the subject. We are at the beginning of a new or semi-new US administration that has a record from the first 4 years and now has continued a policy of pressure, economic pressure, and diplomatic engagement. And as you all know, there was a resumption of nuclear talks just last month in, of all places, Almaty, Kazakhstan. So we do have a negotiating process that's in place. But I'm going to talk about a couple of other aspects of the US-Iran relationship that I think are very important. And here I'm speaking in a personal capacity, my own views, although the Atlantic Council will be coming out with a report in a couple of weeks that incorporates some of these ideas and some specific suggestions. I think what we need to be trying to do, more than resolve the nuclear dispute per se, is to restore diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran. I think that should be a primary goal because many other good things would flow from that. My personal view is that it's not necessary to resolve the nuclear issue before you do that, even though practically it will be difficult to restore diplomatic relations unless there is substantial progress on the nuclear issue. Why diplomatic relations? Well, if you look at the ways in which we've managed to end hostilities with other countries, China, Russia in particular, the restoration of diplomatic relations and the function of a US embassy in the capital of that country has always been a very important part of that. And it would provide for regular and consistent interaction instead of the sporadic talks that we've had over the years where you have a round of nuclear talks in Istanbul and then a half a year goes by before people talk again. It would also restore Iran expertise to the US government. We now are in a situation where we have no one in the State Department, the National Security Council, Defense Department who has ever worked in Iran as a representative of the US government. The last person we had was Ryan Crocker, who was our ambassador in Afghanistan and actually as a junior diplomat had served in Iran, and he's now retired, and that's it. Nobody there who was ever posted to Iran for the US government. Having an embassy in Iran would make it easier to reach out to the Iranian people, which I think is particularly important now, more important perhaps than ever. We need to begin to lay the groundwork for a restoration of diplomatic relations through people-to-people contact. Now, as I mentioned, the Atlantic Council is going to be releasing a report soon, and we're going to try to lay out some specific steps that would facilitate, in particular, people-to-people interaction. Without scooping myself and revealing these specific suggestions, I thought I'd just talk in general about the need to facilitate academic and cultural exchanges. Last week, I was very lucky to be invited to the official opening of an exhibition at the Sackler Gallery in Washington for something called the Cyrus Cylinder. This is an object. It's about 9 inches long. It kind of looks like a small loaf of Jewish rye bread from which somebody has bitten out a chunk. But instead of caraway seeds, there's cuneiform writing all over it. And it's a bit on the stale side. It's 2,600 years old, but the message is fresh and relevant. It recounts the Persian king Cyrus's victory over the Babylonians and his decision, once he had taken Babylon, to free all the various religious and ethnic minorities who had been brought there as slaves. And among them were Jews who were encouraged to go home and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, which indeed they did, which makes Cyrus an early Zionist, I guess one could say. This Cyrus cylinder was discovered in 1879 in what was then the Ottoman Empire, as now Iraq. And it was put into the British Museum. It resides in the permanent collection of the British Museum in London. Right now it's on loan to the United States. It's going to 5 cities. I'm not sure if it's coming to Boston. I don't think so. But it will be touring the US for a year. And it's interesting, the head of the British Museum, Neil McGregor, gave a little talk at this opening. And he said that it was actually the suggestion of the Iranian government that the Cyrus cylinder come here. The British Museum loaned the Cyrus cylinder back to Iran in 2010. And the Iranian authorities, he asked them, where should it go next? And they said, send it to the United States. The cylinder conveys the greatness of Persian history and culture, and it transcends the political food fights that we're having today. And I think the Iranian authorities appreciated the public diplomacy value of this cylinder, sending it to the US to give a sense that Iran is more than a nuclear program. Of course, it also underlines the contrast, unfortunately, between the religious tolerance of Cyrus 2,600 years ago and the rather dismal human rights record of the Islamic Republic today. Coincidentally, as I was participating in this opening, I learned that there are a group of museum directors from Iran who are in the United States right now. And they are here under the auspices of the State Department's International Visitors Program. And there has actually been an uptick in such visits of Iranians coming here. And there have been a number of events in the last few months organized by the national academies, some of them in Iran, some of them in Europe. And this is a very positive trend because after the 2009 presidential elections, which as you know were tainted by allegations of fraud and the crackdown that occurred on the Iranian people after that, these kinds of exchanges went down. They went down dramatically, but they're on the rise again. And this is the sort of thing we should be encouraging. I would hope that Jim Walsh and John Tierman and others, myself, will be able to go back to Iran as well. There are a number of scientific areas in which there can be cooperation, not just cultural areas. While we don't want to be teaching Iran's nuclear scientists how to build a better bomb, there are areas like earthquake prediction, wildlife conservation, air and water quality, urban planning, AIDS research, renewable energy, and the list goes on and on. The national academies have programs in some of these areas. Now, to facilitate these exchanges, I think we should retool our sanctions policy. And again, the report that we have coming out for the Atlantic Council will have some specific suggestions in this area on how we can revise them so that it will be easier for Iranians to come here and also for Americans to go there. I'm going to say a brief word, though, on the nuclear talks. I know Jim's going to talk in much more detail. I mean, ultimately, progress is going to depend on whether we can at least maintain the momentum of diplomatic discussions. I'm not saying we need necessarily a breakthrough, but the talks have to continue without a breakdown. As you may know, there was a round in February in Kazakhstan, and the United States and its negotiating partners showed some greater flexibility than they have in the past. They offered some modest sanctions relief. They also said that Iran would be permitted to continue enriching uranium to a relatively low level, 5% and under, U-235, in return for stopping suspending production of higher enriched uranium, 20% uranium. It was a kind of tacit acknowledgement of Iran's right to enrich uranium, which is something the Iranians had been demanding for quite some time. I think the Iranians are going to have to do more. I think they're going to have to answer the IAEA's questions about past weaponization research before we can get any kind of deal. But there's a possibility that they might begin to do that as well. There are follow-up meetings scheduled in Istanbul and back in Kazakhstan. And the press reaction to this latest round in Iran has been rather favorable. The Iranians have been largely spinning it as a victory, as a sign of Western flexibility, Western appreciation for Iran's point of view. So that's good in terms of building support, popular support for more negotiations. The bigger question, ultimately, is whether the supreme leader of Iran, the Muslim cleric Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, really wants a deal with the US, or whether he just wants a process. I am not like some Iran talking heads who say that he would rule out a deal. I think that if it's the right kind of deal, that he might indeed say yes. I don't believe he is implacably opposed to any kind of deal. But it is tricky. And the kind of détente that I would dearly love to see with Iran is not going to be as easy as it was with the old Soviet Union or with China. Not that those cases were easy. They also took a great deal of preparation. But with China and the old Soviet Union, you had a kind of parity of power with the United States. And you also had systems of government that were not, how shall I put it, obsessed with the United States in terms of finding the United States and everything about the United States to be a threat against the very essence of that system. The Iranian Revolution is still relatively young compared to certainly the Soviet Revolution when we had détente with the Russians. And as you know, the 1979 revolution was really all about the United States in some ways. It was about getting rid of a dictator who had been put back on the throne by the US, who was supported by the US. It was about expunging American and Western influences from Iranian culture and establishing independence from the great superpower. So this is a tricky issue, and it's such that Iran feels that it has to really be able to show that it's achieved something in return for concessions to the United States. Allowing American diplomats and tourists and businessmen back into Iran in a big way is also rather threatening, I think, to the Iranian regime. But on the other hand, a restoration of relations would also be validation that the Iranian Revolution had succeeded, because the United States would be recognizing the legitimacy of the Iranian government. What can we do now? I think one of the things that the Obama administration should do is revive a proposal that was thought about, contemplated, and they almost reached that level under the George W. Bush administration at least twice, and that is ask to put Americans back in Iran to staff an interest section that would process visas for Iranians seeking to come to the United States. Right now, if you're an Iranian, you can apply for a visa online. We have a virtual embassy that was created about a year ago. So you can file your application online, but to actually receive a visa, you have to go to a neighboring country. You have to go to Turkey or the United Arab Emirates or Armenia. U.S. should ask to put Americans back there. It would facilitate things for Iranians coming here, and it would also provide some much-needed expertise for the U.S. government. We would have Americans on the ground who could get a sense of the current political environment in the country, and they wouldn't have to rely on people like me and Jim for secondhand information. If we ask and they say no, we should publicize that. That puts the onus on the Iranian government. The picture that was up at the beginning was a picture that I took when I was last in Iran in August. I was allowed in to cover the non-aligned summit that Iran hosted, and I had not been there for 4 years. When I was there in August, the change in mood was really dramatic. People are really depressed, frustrated, unhappy. They're feeling the pinch of the economic sanctions for which they blame the United States now as well as their own government. And they're feeling hopeless. If there were to be some progress between the United States and Iran, I think that would give an enormous morale boost to the Iranian people, and I think the Supreme Leader knows that. Even the process of starting negotiations again caused the rial, the Iranian currency, to increase in value against the dollar slightly. So there is a tremendous psychological benefit that could come from the beginnings of rapprochement, from some partial deal with the Iranians on the nuclear issue. So I am hopeful that the Iranian government will take yes for an answer, that it will take whatever concessions are put on the table and spin that as a huge victory for the Islamic Republic, and that we can begin this process of building bridges so that relations can be restored and we can see a more normal relationship between these two great countries. And I think that's my 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop that. I'm going to let Jim take over, and then we'll be happy to take your questions.
Going to require some technical adjustments here. So if I had elevator music, I would play it. But I don't. And maybe we'll have slides, and maybe we won't. That is Ireland, which is not Iran. But they sit near each other at the UN. So I wonder about the relationship. As you know, you sit alphabetically by country in the UN. So why aren't you loading, Mr. PowerPoint? Well, while that works or doesn't work, let me first start by thanking John and the Center for International Studies for having me come and speak. And primarily, it's a great honor for me to be with Barbara. When you go and you buy a mattress, a really nice new mattress, you buy a mattress and they give you the box spring for free. I am the box spring in this relationship. She is a veteran analyst, terrific interviewer, author, and in a time when media, which used to be defined by newspapers, is undergoing such tremendous change, we are lucky to have someone as knowledgeable about the region continuing to practice that art of journalism when it is fading in so many places. So I think it's terrific that she's here. And I also understand that her husband, Michael, is here. Will you stand up, please? Let's welcome you. And son. We want to give you a warm MIT welcome.
He would have brought the dog, but he died.
Okay. Sorry to hear that. And clearly the presence of family members means we're going to have a civil discussion about Iran, If you have disagreements with what Barbara said or what I say, especially if you have really strong, vociferous disagreements, I would urge that you see her family members afterwards and discuss it with them. And I want to say I apologize right now for comparing your wife to a mattress. That was inappropriate, and I will not do that again. Okay, well, with those preliminaries behind us, and I still don't have my slides. Okay, well, that's really bad. We'll just have to go without them. Let me tell you what I was going to do. Normally, I would just get up here and talk about, dive into the nuclear issue. We just had a new IAEA report out a week or so ago, which does add some new things to the mix. We've had, as Barbara pointed out, negotiations and changes in the U.S. position. We know less about the Iranian position, but there are different things happening. And I would normally just jump on that. But I decided this morning not to do that because I've given so many talks about Iran, and what I find in question and answer and in talking to audience members afterward is there's tremendous diversity of views about the core facts about Iran and Iran's foreign policy. And I think it would be useful before talking about the nuclear issue to sort of frame this and get some things just on the table that we can all agree on, or mostly agree on, or at least put down so that we know where we disagree. And then we'd be able to have a more intelligent conversation about the nuclear issue. So the first thing I would say is Iran is not the Soviet Union. Iran is roughly the size of Alaska, and the United States is roughly the size of the United States, more or less. GDP, come on, that was funny. See, if that was a slide, you would have laughed at that, because it's a funny slide, but you didn't laugh because it's not funny anymore. Our GDP, roughly $127 billion. theirs is 14 trillion. I'm sorry, switch that. Iran's is $827 billion. Our economy, GDP, is $14 trillion, right? So this is not the same thing at all. They spend $8 billion on their military. We spend $670 billion plus or minus on our military, again. Not the Soviet Union. And so I think when we talk about the threats and the nature of the challenge, it's important to have it in some comparative perspective. And it also should tell us something about how they will view us and behave with us. It may tell us something about their negotiation strategy, the fact that there is imbalance between the two sides. That we should expect that when one state is stronger and one state is much weaker, that they will behave differently. Let's talk a little bit about the evolution of Iran's foreign policy. I think as we've heard so much about it over the years, and I've done this for more than a decade, but we tend to have a sort of a fixed image in our minds about Iran, and Ahmadinejad is that fixed image. But really, we've seen different Irans over time since the revolution. Right after the revolution, it was a more radical regime, I would say, both in terms of its human rights record, but also in terms of its foreign policy. The talk was exporting the revolution to other states. There was the vicious, bloody Iran-Iraq war. Iran at that point was still anti-Soviet and anti-American. It was just a very different period. The Soviet Union goes away, and I think you also see a growing pragmatism and focus on state interests, like traditional countries do in their foreign policy over time. So it starts out revolutionary, and it begins to follow rather than simply religious principles in foreign policy. It is the Islamic Republic, after all. No, it becomes more pragmatic, and like most nation states, focuses on issues. With Khatami, we get the dialogue of civilizations. With Ahmadinejad, we get more emphasis on rights and confrontation. But in both cases, their friends are Syrian or Christian Armenia and Sunni Syria. Those are foreign policy choices that are made on national interest, not out of revolutionary ideology. Where are we now in a post-2009 disputed election territory? I'm not sure. I think that's still working itself out. And since we have a presidential election coming up in June, more Ahmadinejad, I think that's going to tell us a lot about where Iranian foreign policy is evolving after 2009. Let me say something about the elements, what I consider the core elements of that foreign policy. One is religion and ideology, Islam and Shiism and anti-imperialism and revolution. I think it's a component. I don't think it's as strong a component as the other three. The other is national interest. I've already spoken to you about that. And that's predominantly security and oil. I think there are two other issues involved in Iranian foreign policy. One is psychology. This is murky territory, and people feel uncomfortable about it, and I feel uncomfortable about it. But I would say, like the United States, and when I've said this in Iran, it offended people, like the United States, Iran is a prideful country, like France, like India, maybe some others. They have a sense of a glorified past, and that's important to them, and they therefore also have a sense of humiliation. And there is this, like in American foreign policy, there's a sense of exceptionalism. They're not Arabs, they're not Turks, they're in the center of Southwest Asia. They know what they're doing, and they should have authority in the area. They should be looked on as the leader of the area because they are exceptional. And I think finally, in addition to religion and ideology and national interest and psychology, the domestic politics plays a large role. Even if without the disputed elections, even prior to 2009, factionalism and disputes within the leadership, within the elite leadership, were rambunctious and ferocious, and they continue to be so. Let me say, can't show that slide. Let me say a little bit what I think their foreign policy goals are. Domestic policy goals, I think they just want to promote internal stability and hold on to power, which is mostly what states want to do anyway, but they want to do it and they're more authoritarian. Militarily, I think they're a status quo power. They're not looking to go pick a fight with someone, to send a lot of troops and invade someplace. I think they're mostly defensive oriented, and what they are looking to do is build retaliatory capability. So they're happy where they are. They don't want to grab a lot of territory. They'd like to throw their political weight around, but they're not going to be sending armies off. Diplomatically, I think it's all about countering the P5+1 policy of isolation, and they're desperately trying not to lose influence as Syria spirals downward. They want to gain influence in Iraq, their neighbor, and they want to counter the Saudis. And then, of course, there are a variety of economic interests, from Caspian Sea issues to economic reform, that are a focus of their economic capability or economic foreign policy. Let me say a word about nuclear, and I will wrap up. There seems to be much confusion about the status and objective of the Iranian nuclear program. And so let me read from, every year the Director of National Intelligence, he's the top intelligence official of the United States. He testifies before the U.S. Senate about the state of the world and threats. And so here's his testimony about the status and future of Iran's nuclear program. I'm just going to read it verbatim. He says, quote, "Iran has the capacity to eventually produce nuclear weapons, making the central issue its political will to do so. We assess Iran as keeping open the option to develop nuclear weapons, should it choose to do so. We do not know, however, if Iran will eventually decide to build nuclear weapons." All right, that's pretty clear. So Iran had a nuclear weapons program. It halted it in 2003. It has not resumed it. It has a basic nuclear weapons capability that if it was determined to do it, it could push on through and do it, but it has not yet made that decision. So that's where we're at on the nuclear file. Let me talk a little bit about these negotiations and segue from nuclear to negotiations, and then I'll be done. And then we can go back to listening to Barbara. So I think the past, I've, again, been observing this for almost more than a decade now. And one sees a pattern, and one sees the same things over and over again. There is, as Barbara alluded to, and that I will expand on in a minute, a history that is grounded, well grounded on both sides of mistrust. Both sides have done lots of things to win the suspicion of the other. There is also nationalism and pride, which I alluded to in talking about the psychology of foreign policy. I think the absence of relations that Barbara mentions in terms of trying to move forward, this absence of relations means not only do we not understand each other, that sometimes we will send signals to one another and they will not be seen for what they are. We miss each other's signals. A big one that I see is both sides refuse to negotiate if they are in the weaker position. Understandably, if you're weak, you don't want to negotiate when you're weak. But when you're strong, what both sides want to do is press their advantage. Right now, you're strong. You want to be able to take advantage of the strength. You're in the driver's seat. So if you don't negotiate when you're weak, and you don't negotiate when you're strong, you don't negotiate. And around this ball goes. Now, you may talk to each other, and there are talks that break down, but that has been a recurring scene over time. Another is a positive gesture by one side is seen as evidence of weakness. Aha, they're giving in to our position. We need to move forward and press them onward. Iranians or Americans can say this because the thing switches. Over 10 years, it's switched back and forth. So if you do something nice, or try to do something that the other side is seen as a positive, they take that as evidence for continuing pressure. And of course, opponents at home are willing to savage any agreement that might possibly be arrived at, whether in Tehran or Washington. Despite those burdens, we've had success before. In 2003, we did have an agreement, so it's not as if it's impossible, but it's very hard for the two sides to do it. And I think of those many things, and there are different arguments about what the problem is here, I really do think there's a big issue about mistrust. I think a lot of Iranians believe, even whether they say it out loud or not, a lot of the Iranians in the leadership believe that the U.S. ultimately wants regime change. And I think there are a lot of Americans who believe that in their hearts they believe Iran wants a nuclear weapon. Now, it is not the policy of the United States to seek regime change. And it is not the policy, according to the DNI, for Iran to build nuclear weapons. But in their hearts, there are large segments in both countries who believe the opposite to be true about the other. And it's pretty understandable, frankly. If you're in Iran and you're making an argument the U.S. wants regime change, you say, well, 1953 coup, axis of evil after we helped you guys in Afghanistan, the Iraqi invasion, support for Libyan and Syrian rebels, assassination of nuclear scientists, recognition of the MEK, support for Jindal, sanctions, ever new sets of new nuclear issues being introduced, seemingly to go on forever. That's the way it looks. I'm not saying that's all true, but that's the way it looks if you're sitting in Tehran. If you're sitting in Washington, it looks like you had a secret enrichment facility, okay? And you build way more enrichment capacity than you will ever need or use. And you've built it before you actually have many functioning nuclear power plants. That looks suspicious. They know that, people know that Iran admits that it got help from AQ Khan, that it had a weapons design, it kept Fordo secret, it won't abide by the additional protocol, it's clearly covering up the Parchin military site. I mean, they are digging soil and carting it away. I mean, clearly, come on, who are you kidding? So, and the production of 20%. Now, in response to the Iranian government says, no, we are not interested in a nuclear weapon. We have a fatwa. We'll pay attention to our words. And in the US, they say, look, we have a policy here, and it's not regime change, and we keep telling you this in words, and you don't pay attention to us. So there's real similarity here in the positions and the way this has worked out. And given that historical context, I think it makes it very difficult, especially in the absence of diplomatic relations, to overcome those things and come to an agreement. And frankly, I'd love to predict that we're going to get an agreement, but I think we're in a period right now where we're going to get more of the same. I don't think the Israelis are going to strike. I think both sides are more comfortable with where it is now than it would be if they had to make a big change in their position. So I think the irony is they both share more or less the same aspirations for the near term, which is probably modest by any measure, if anything at all. So that's, as a guy who works on Iran, that's awesome news because it means I'll be relevant. You know, I'll continue to be relevant for a while. A friend of mine said, I just got back from Seoul, and a friend of mine said, because of I was there in between the Korean nuclear test and the Madam Park's inauguration. And this friend of me, a friend of mine, at least claims he's a friend of mine, says, you know, Jim, Iran and North Korea, they're your axis of prosperity. And so I certainly hope so. So let me stop there so we can hear what Barbara has to say. Oh yeah, I will call on people. Is my audio on?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah. Is mine on as well? Yeah. Okay.
So we'll take questions. Please be brief and make them questions. But I want to start with a question,
Cheater.
if I may, and that is the recent controversy over the Parchin facility. This is a military base, a military facility, which the IAEA is trying to get into to inspect, believing, I think with some evidence, that there was potentially some radioactivity there. What was the evidence again?
Evidence of nuclear explosive testing, not with fissile material, but
Right.
fissile
Explosive testing. And Iran so far has not seen its way clear to allowing them in. Is that correct?
They've allowed it. People think Parchin military base, it's some, you know, base. It's actually this gigantic complex, you know, with buildings and buildings and buildings. So the IAEA actually was able to conduct a visit, not an inspection, once or twice. I think it's twice.
I think it was once in 2008, but they did not go to the building, which they've subsequently said was used for testing of some sort of weapons-related.
Yeah. So they want to go to this building.
They want to go to that particular building, and the Iranians, instead of letting them go to that building, destroyed the building and have dug up all the earth under the building and carted it away, and are building a new building on top of the site, which, when it is completed, I imagine the Iranians will let them go.
Then they will let them in. That would be my prediction. And I was told that I should try to say something controversial. And so here's my opportunity. I want to say this is the only controversial thing I have to say. So as you all are aware on the nuclear stuff, there are two parallel processes here, right? There's the P5+1 negotiation, which is the negotiation between the 5 members of the Security Council in Germany and Iran. That is a political negotiation among nation states. And on the other side is a technical negotiation between Iran and the International Atomic Energy Agency over past activities. And they, you know, I assume that Iran assumes that these things are all linked and sort of managed from on top. But I don't know. I'm sure the U.S. has influence on IAEA. I'm sure IAEA is its own institution too. But in any case, the question is, what do you do with these past activities? Someone has done something wrong. What do? Do we prosecute them, find out the last shred of truth, and hold the violators accountable? That's sort of IAEA's mandate right now. And I'm in favor of that. I hate nuclear weapons. We should pursue and punish nuclear weapons violators. But there's also this thing about where are we going in the future with Iran's nuclear program, and which is going to be more important at the end of the day. Getting an agreement that puts us on a track where we can have assurance that Iran will not pursue nuclear weapons and where this issue can be resolved, or getting the answers to the past. This is sort of like war crime stuff. You know, do you go and find out what actually happened, or you try to worry about the future more? And my own view in this case is, and contrary to most of my colleagues, I'm much more interested in getting something done about the future than I am settling up the past cases. I'll stipulate that they had a weapons program in 2003 and that they're destroying that building at Parchin because they have something to hide. That's my view. But I don't really care about that so much. I care about trying to get on a track where we avoid unnecessary military conflicts in the Middle East, and we get a resolution of the nuclear issue and can try to push forward. So I'm glad you asked that question, because that's a separate process. It's going to have to find some sort of resolution one way or another. I would prefer it be resolved swiftly once there's a political solution in place. And I'm told if you have a question, you should go to the microphones. And say who you are. Yeah, so if you have a question, there's a microphone on either side. Again, I want to stress.
You can go first. Right. Hi. Carol Savitz from SSP and the CIS also. So having described this impasse that we seem to be in, and there was an op-ed, I guess, in today's Financial Times sort of arguing that where we are now is better than sort of a worst case scenario. How would you see your way out of it? And Jim, I know you've been working on this. I mean, what kinds of suggestions would you make to the negotiators? Is one of them actually separating out this issue of past crimes in quotation marks in order to move forward? How do you restore the trust? What's the ABC of getting to someplace different from where we are?
Let me take that great question and give it to Barbara.
Okay. Thanks, and thanks for the kind remarks. I don't mind being compared to a mattress in this case. I think the solution is very clear, and we've seen the outlines of it already in the negotiations that were held just a few weeks ago. The Iranians, what is the most destabilizing aspect of the Iranian program? It's enriching to 20% in the facility at Fordo, which is built into a mountain which Iran hid until it was discovered by US and I think French intelligence and revealed before the world. So you need to, in this case, the request is for them to suspend, not end, but suspend production of 20% enrichment at Fordo, and take the stockpile and turn it into fuel for a reactor that produces medical isotopes. Just keep them below the threshold of 240 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium. That is the Israeli red line. I don't know how many of you saw the rather interesting performance of Bibi Netanyahu at the United Nations General Assembly, where he had this picture that looked like something out of Roadrunner, a Roadrunner cartoon with a bomb, with a fuse, and a red line, and so on. That's the Israeli red line, 240 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium. So keep them below that. As long as the Iranians stay below that line, I don't think we'll see military action by the Israelis or anybody else. And if there's a way to get the Iranians to agree to suspend, then they get some sanctions relief in return. And we buy some time. We put some more time on the map for the eventual restoration of diplomatic relations, for changes hopefully to take place within Iran so that the regime is not so horrendous in terms of the way it treats its own people. I don't know if we're going to get there this year. I mean, every year they say it's the year of decision, and this is the year that we'll find out if it's war or peace with the Islamic Republic, and somehow a year goes by and it never happens. But the Iranians now have 167 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium, according to the latest IEA report. They have some that they've turned into a kind of powder, which can be used for fuel for the Tehran research reactor. So, that's like 25 kilograms more than in the last IEA report. So, I mean, at some point, they may reach 240, and then we really have to worry.
Let me jump in on this question. There are lots of things to say about it. I think the changing position in the U.S. position from the previous talks to this on Fordo is significant, because I've seen both an Iranian proposal and outlines of a U.S. proposal, and the U.S. proposal had been shuttering and disabling Fordo. And I thought that was a non-starter, just like some of the things in the Iranian side are non-starters. Both sides ask a lot and give very little in the previous set of the negotiations. And the reason why I thought that this was a non-starter is, you have Israel who is threatening to bomb their enrichment facilities, and this is and is saying, we don't like this underground facility because we can't bomb it. There just aren't many countries in the international system that say, okay, we'll make it easier for you. We'll shut that down, and then you'll just have these above ground facilities, and they will be easy. No countries don't respond that way. And so I thought this was a non-starter. So now they found something between, that's not tearing it apart so it can never be recast or reconstituted, but something that begins to put it in a more restrictive context. So I think that's probably a winning way to go. But, you know, in some ways the restraint is already there. This is why I'm not actually that optimistic about the negotiations. Referring to what Barbara had said before, and she's right to say, over the last three quarterly IAEA reports, it's become evident. The first one I've wondered in my head, is this really on purpose? But after three, I knew it was on purpose, which is they produce the 20%, but blend it down or use it for other things so they never cross this line of one bomb's worth of 20% sitting. So if they're not doing it by accident, if they're doing it on purpose, then they sense that there's restraint, you know, there's some level of restraint. So they're probably, if, you know, they've done it the first 3 months, it's not by accident. They have to sort of work to do it, to not go above that level. So I expect that that's going to continue. So we'll feel a little better about that. That's where it takes the pressure off. But there are other things coming down the pike. There are new improved centrifuges. There's the Eric heavy water reactor that's going to come online in about a year's time, plus or minus. And so I think this is going to go on. Both sides told me, Ahmadinejad told me in response to a question last September, that they were open to a small deal on nuclear. And I spoke with someone in the State Department who said they wanted a small deal on nuclear. Both sides want a small deal on nuclear because they don't want to do the hard things. But I think part of the problem is that then shrinks your negotiation space. You got two groups who don't like each other, and don't trust each other, are negotiating over a small thing, which seems like that would be good, except that means you don't have other stuff to trade off to get a deal because your space is so small.
One other aspect I think that's very important is that the Iranians would like to see a roadmap for the ultimate lifting of all nuclear-related sanctions before they start down this road. So I think you can have the small deal, but you need to sketch out, you know, a step-by-step, they do X, we do Y, and how it's going to work for this really to succeed. And we haven't seen that yet.
And you can see how, and again, I want to recall the first slide you didn't see about Iran is not the Soviet Union, that they see themselves, so they're a weaker party. It's, you know, P5 plus 1 is essentially 6 against 1, right? That's what it is, with sometimes China and Russia defecting. But against very powerful countries, and some of whom who are not at the talks who have threatened to attack. So they're going to be careful about their negotiating position. They, I think understandably, they want to say, especially the ones who think this is all about regime change, are saying, you know, it's just going to be one thing after another with you guys. We're going to settle up this, and then you're going to worry about that, and this is just go on. So we need to see what the end looks like. Totally reasonable. The Americans are saying they just want us to put all our stuff out on the table so that they can see what the deal looks like and then pocket the concessions and walk on. And they're not really serious. And why should we make a serious offer when they don't even come to the negotiating table and aren't serious? So unfortunately, there's plenty of room. You know, if we were going to get a deal because it was the logical thing to do and in the interests of all the sides, we would have had a deal 5 or 7 years ago. Instead, we get this going on. And this has now forced me, the pain that working on North Korea and Iran have inflicted on me over 10 years, have now forced me to think in a scholarly way about this, and that is protracted negotiations are really interesting animals. We sort of think of that negotiation, well, over time sanctions will have more impact, or they'll be able to build more centrifuges, and we sort of try to game the future with starting from 2 or 3 assumptions. Well, there are a bunch of things you don't see when you project into the future. And then all this time passes, and it's not neutral. The Iranians, in my view, would have never enriched to 20% if we had gotten a deal back in 2003. It would have entered their heads. They would have thought, we'd never be able to do that. But things happen that then through action creates these new possibilities, some of which are negative and some of which are positive. The U.S. would have never imposed banking sanctions, SWIFT sanctions, 7 years ago. That was people think we never sanctioned banking things. That's you know, violates international norms. We should never.
Europeans certainly wouldn't have.
Yeah, no one would. Europeans not buying oil. So these things go on. When you have a bitter negotiation between people who don't like each other, going for 10 years, I'm not going to analogize to marriages on this, but I'm thinking there might be something here. You know, it's not neutral 10 years. These things, it's difficult on its own, and then other things happen, and you end up in places you don't. So I worry that even though it makes sense to get a deal, it's hard to get a deal, and it'll be easier to stick with the unpleasant status quo in the minds of the negotiators than it will be to get off the dime. And then therefore we will suffer other things. There's going to be a naval accident, or the heavy water reactor is going to freak people out, or someone's going to get killed, or something, or there'll be something else. But I know, talk about rambling. It's made me ramble. Essentially, this long process has made me a rambler.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
My name is Puri. I'm from MIT, mechanical engineering, doing my PhD. So my question's for Jim. I'm going to ask you that basically, if you were an advisor to the Supreme Leader of Iran,
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
If you were an advisor to the Supreme Leader of Iran, and you're an expert in international security, and I'm sure he has many intelligent advisors too, I'm going to basically looking from the Iranian viewpoint, like they have their own arguments. For example, Parchin is a military site that is not part of NPT, and they're going to visit it. They have visited other places before, and a couple of months later, there have been attacks, assassinations, and many different things. And so why would you trust, again, for example, they're going to visit Parchin today, a month later they're going to point out another place, Iran, like Iraq or Qom, other places,
Mm-hmm.
So what would be a good answer, good answer for that? Or for example, as you mentioned, building a Farduz facility was basically, because when they say all the options are on our table, and all, I guess we all know, is the code for the nuclear weapons probably. So why would you not do that? And my second question, actually,
That's the first question?
is for both of you, is that basically, as you said, there has been 6, 10, 15 rounds of sanctions, right? So even in a step-by-step process, basically, here's the problem. I guess, for example, what Iranians have, the chips they have to play, it's like 20%, Farduz facility and other things. So the way they're looking at it is basically if we let 20% go, only for letting us to sell the oil, and trade it with the gold, not even money. So when is this going to end? Basically, because from their viewpoint, they think
Let me stop you there. That sounds good. That's more than we're going to be able to address.
One more sentence, because in their viewpoint, they think that after a couple of steps, U.S. is going to still keep most of the sanctions in place,
right,
just to weaken Iran's position in the region. Basically, they don't think nuclear issue is going to be the final thing.
Yeah, I hear you, and and they're probably right. I think the international sanctions will come off and the European sanctions will come off before the U.S. sanctions, because people in the Congress are going to fight that tooth and nail. Now, the executive has broad authority there, but I want you to address that question. Let me go to his first question. So it was hard for me to hear the second, that first question, when you started with the phrase, let's imagine you're an advisor to the Supreme Leader. I'm thinking there's got to be a joke there, but I can't put my hands around it. I don't look good in a turban, number one. I don't think I would look good. That's not offensive. That's just a joke. If I was an advisor to the Supreme Leader, I think that if you have to figure out what the cause is to have the right remedy. There are different people who point to different causes. I think some people point to the negotiation space, some people point to mistrust, some people point to other things. If it is mistrust, for the reasons that I described, or even if it's not mistrust, but there's enough of suspicion in both polities that it affects how they react to each other, then it seems to me that the only way to do this, that it's going to be very hard for this to progress incrementally. I'm not saying we need a grand bargain, but if you go a little bit at a time, the chances for things to unravel as opposed to progress seem to favor unraveling rather than progressing. I think, and I have not thought this through, I think you have to find a way to break the mindset, that both sides, and I've told this to both sides, you need to do something that the other side doesn't expect, that does not conform to their expectations. Both sides come to the negotiating table and say, with the minimum thing, which is normal bargaining behavior. That's what you're supposed to do. Start with the minimum offer. But this has gone on so long, everyone says, look, they're not serious. This is just evidence that they're not serious. So I think you have to do something where the Americans look at that and say, oh, this is different. Maybe this is for real. And the Americans should, P5+1, should do the same thing. They need to do something that would get the attention of the Iranians, that would tell the Iranians we're different. Now, when you say this to both sides, The Iranians say, we're the weaker party, it's the US that should go first. And when you say it to the Americans, they say, if we make concessions, the Iranians will pocket them and walk away. And I think, you know, there's probably a little truth in both those things, right? They are the weaker party, and they, you know, they might do it.
Yeah.
So I think it's hard.
I go back to the question of the morale. Now, you're Iranian. I don't know when you were last there, but the mood of the public is so negative, so depressed, and obviously the Supreme Leader is cushioned from that to some extent, but he must be aware. He's got elections coming up, presidential elections. The Iranians would like people to come out and vote, even though the choice of candidates is probably going to be extremely limited this time. Something like even a partial deal with the US would really be an injection of optimism in the society. It would help stabilize the currency. And they don't have to get American sanctions necessarily removed. What they need to do is to be able to sell oil a little bit more easily, whether it's to Asia or whether the Europeans could relieve their embargo on Iranian oil. Just a little bit would go a long way. As long as oil is around $100 or $90 a barrel, it would go a long way toward dealing with the problems that are facing that society. So that's why I think that if the Supreme Leader chooses to spin what's been put on the table as a victory, we might actually see some progress this time around. The system in Iran obviously is authoritarian. It's hardly a democracy, but popular opinion does count, and the economic situation right now is dire.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I do enjoy your very positive, I can say, approach to. My name is Mansour Salsabili. I am a research fellow at the Belfer Center, Harvard. Mm-hmm. And I happen to be a former diplomat as well. And my question to Barbara is 2 points. One is about diplomatic relation as a target of your suggestion. Prior to diplomatic relation, we have consulate relation. Prior to consulate relation, we have expansion in merchandise, in academic relation, in university cultural relations. Unfortunately, we see faced with a contradictory approach of the Congress in this sense. Actually, including, I can say, no diplomatic contact, no positive approach toward Iran by expanding on the sanction as well. How can you make diplomatic relation and opening an embassy as a target when there is no even minimum cultural relation, even their old past gone missing right now? Second point is about the past research as a past research clarification as a guarantor of the no nuclear bombs in Iran. How much digging the past can work for the future? This is my question. Won't you think if we push Iran into the right track to deal with international community, it can help Iran to resolve that? And also, back to the 2003 agreement between Iran and the IAEA, there were some corrective measures that exactly did deal with these past failures of Iran.
Let me stop you there. You said there aren't cultural contacts, but I don't know if you were here earlier. There are cultural contacts. I mean, one of the positive things that we've seen in the last 5-6 months, there are more Iranians who are participating in academic exchanges with Americans than there have been since 2009. There's a group of Iranian museum directors touring American museums right now. There are plans for more of this. One of the reasons that I suggest that we put an interest section staffed by Americans back in Tehran is to facilitate these sorts of things. There have been 5 Nobel laureates who've gone to Iran American Nobel laureates who've gone to Iran over the last 10 years. They've gotten rapturous receptions, hundreds of students in the hall, hundreds, thousands more watching online. So there is a residue of appreciation, certainly for American scientific prowess and American culture in Iran that we need to foster, even while we have these nuclear negotiations going on. And there's some things we can do with the sanctions to make this a little bit easier, but Congress is supporting this. as far as I know. There is money available that the State Department is using in its International Visitors Program. There's other money, foundation money, and we can do things. We can twin universities in Iran and the US. We can do a lot more on this front to lay the groundwork for the restoration of relations.
What I mean is diminishing, not, of
it's
course,
actually-
there is a million of Iranians residing in the United States, and there is a cultural relation between the two, and it could be expanded much more than
much
right
more,
now.
yeah.
I mean diminish it because of 2 years ago, we have a currency of Iranian was 1,000 2 months for $1. Today is 4,000, and it is 400% decrease the value of Iranian
That
currency.
certainly had an
That
impact, yeah.
directly has an impact on the nature of the relation between the two countries.
No, absolutely, absolutely. But there were 7,000 Iranians studying in the United States in 2012, which is actually an increase over the previous year. Now, the collapse of the currency may have an impact. It may reduce the numbers of Iranians who can study here. But that, it had gone up since 2009. So we need to maintain this as much as possible. On your second question on the past military activity, I don't think Iran would ever see a complete lifting of sanctions on the nuclear front until it explains what it was doing in the late 90s through 2003. That's going to have to be cleared up one way or the other for that to happen. But one can make some progress on a partial deal and focus on that and lift some of the sanctions and at least start a virtuous circle before we get to that point.
Excuse me, Mike.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. We only have so many questions. But if everyone who asks a question, we get through them all, and you have more questions, then we can come back.
Thank you, folks. I'm Jim Schneider. I sell papers for the Globe and the Herald in front of the Dunkin' Donuts in Charlestown. I see Jim at the meetings of the Security Studies Center. Frankly, once again, from the point of view of an Iranian negotiator, why do I want to have anything to do with France and Britain on the negotiating table, or for that matter, anybody from MIT? And I don't intend that as a dig against MIT. I like the place. But as an Iranian negotiator, I might not. And the reason I say that is you have the Koch brothers who are running Noble Energy, which is developing the Leviathan field 80 miles off the Israeli coast. It's also developing a 100 billion barrel deposit in the Falkland Islands for Great Britain, which is seeing a decline in its North Sea deposits. So I'm dealing with people that they're going to, heads they win, tails they win. I mean, these are the negotiators I have to deal with. And in the meantime, somebody that isn't even allowed or doesn't want to be in the group, I can't even talk to them as part of the. I gotta have Britain and France instead of Israel. Who, I mean, we're like this, but they're off somewhere out there, and I'm stuck with the French and the British. What kind of deal is that?
Yeah, well, I think it's, as I indicated in my remarks, and I want to hear what you have to say about this, Barbara. I think there are all sorts of reasons why it's difficult. But there are all sorts of things. Everyone's suffering right now. There are no big winners in this game. Iran's only ally in the region, Syria, is in significant crisis and is probably not long for this world. I mean, I don't know, and that's their only ally. They were riding a crest pre-Arab Spring of sort of popularity. This is pre-2009 election because they were relatively more democratic than other states in the region. The bloom is off the rose on that one after 2009, and the latest poll numbers from the region suggest that Arab states don't look up to Iran. So whether in terms of popular culture or in geopolitical alliances, informal or otherwise, they're in a relatively worse position. And economically, I look at the IMF numbers. They did crash hard last year. They look like they're coming up this year. But it's not great. It's no fun being isolated, especially when you're super proud and have have this thing about exceptionalism and humiliation, all the rest. So I think being on the receiving end of political isolation and sanctions is not a pleasant experience. So I think they have reasons to want to get on a different path, and we have reasons to want to get on a different path because the nuclear program is every day gets bigger, not smaller. We're not winning this either. This is getting worse. And in a year, there'll be a heavy water reactor, which is an independent route to producing plutonium for, for weapons use, potentially. So I don't see this as, I don't see us sitting pretty and everything's a joyride for us either. So I think objectively, both states have reason to want to get to a deal, but there are all these other things going on.
On the France and Britain and so on, that question specifically, the sanctions, the big sanctions are the UN Security Council sanctions. So having the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council represented in the talks, I think, is useful because at some point, if this is going to be resolved, the UN Security Council will have to lift those sanctions. And Obama has done an absolutely phenomenal job of unifying the international community on the subject. Under the Bush administration, steps were finally made in the second term, but by and large, the United States was refusing to sit down with Iran, was setting preconditions that the Iranians had to completely stop their program first. And Obama reversed the psychology of that, and this is the reason why the Iranians are feeling the pain and why they have come back to the talks and why we might have a partial deal. So, I think it's useful. At the same time, the US, and Obama has said this several times, and John Kerry has said this several times, is open to a bilateral conversation with Iranians. And I think that is going to be absolutely necessary if a lot of these other issues are going to be resolved on the nuclear question, on Syria, on Israel, on all the other problems that we have with the Iranian government support for terrorism and so on. Iran is treating bilateral talks as a reward to the United States, which is fascinating. I mean, they could just as easily spin it as a victory for them if they wanted to, but right now they're acting as though this would be a great reward to sit down one-on-one with the US. And this is an example of the way they use their weakness. It's a little like the North Koreans. The North Koreans are always said to practice judo diplomacy, right? And I think the Iranians do as well. It's a kind of asymmetric thing where they take their weakness and they turn it into a strength. So when the day comes that they actually, that their foreign minister sits down with John Kerry, they're going to say that this is a huge victory for Iran and so on, and this is a gracious gesture on the part of the Iranians to deign to sit down with a representative of the great Satan.
Because I think they're proud of their heritage.
Very much so.
Thank you very much. My name is Joseph Owen. I work here at MIT in the mechanical engineering department. And I'm wondering, it's 70 years since we detonated the first nuclear weapon. So from an engineering perspective, it's only going to get easier to build the bomb. So how does the situation in Iran and/or North Korea inform sort of the international vision of sort of sustainably dealing with the problem? Because what you don't want to do is turn a nuclear weapons program into the ultimate bargaining chip to get the US on the table. And what we've seen, a lot of nations are now technologically capable of starting such a program. So how do sort of the specifics of Iran and North Korea, do they help us form a global strategy, or
I am ecstatic that you asked that question. That's my favorite question I've received in a year because I just finished a paper on this very topic. So if we all have 30 minutes, I would like to I will give a super short answer to this. I don't think the non-proliferation regime is sustainable in a world in which all sovereign states have a right to enrichment, which is not in the NPT, and where they all own fuel cycle facilities that could produce weapons usable material. I just don't. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think all 190 countries are going to do that. But I don't think Iran and North Korea are sort of. It could be a death by 1,000 drips of the water. It's Iran, it's North Korea, maybe 10 years will pass, maybe it'll be someone else, and maybe it'll be someone else. But that's not good. And the international nuclear order is changing. It's not just the international political order with a rising China and a US having a competitor. The international nuclear order is changing. And that used to be dominated by the United States and Japan. And Japan, for all its problems at home with its having reprocessed material and all the rest of it, they were good on exports. They've been a leader in international nonproliferation. And so the leverage of the US, which really isn't in the nuclear game anymore, and the leverage of Japan, which just had Fukushima, and essentially is going to have to export or die its nuclear industry, and they have 3 big players. Their declining influence, and you have the Koreans' rising influence who are interested in pyro processing, and you have the Chinese who are not yet in the market, but we expect that in 10 years they'll be selling reactors. And then the question will be, what will the future of the fuel cycle look like then? Where traditional restraints on the sale of enrichment reprocessing seem to decay over competition and where older players are weaker. So I think we need to do something, be thinking about that now, use what little leverage we have now. And for the weapons, we have the NPT. That's a treaty that deals with weapons, no weapons, super successful treaty. On the back end, we're starting to have stuff around the issue of nuclear terrorism and fissile material management. We're starting to get a proto-regime that looks at restricting or policing or otherwise paying attention to nuclear material on the back end, particularly plutonium. But there's nothing on the front end. Countries are entitled to build enrichment and reprocessing if they want to. That's the way it is. And all our policy work on that, on the front end, is all on the supply side, trying to restrict the sale through the individual 1, 2, 3 agreements or through the nuclear suppliers group. But we do nothing on the demand side. And I think we're going to have to develop some new ways of thinking about this, some new principles or different ways of doing things. I'm not going to call it a regime if we're going to deal with the demand for enrichment and reprocessing. Or we're going to have Iran's and North Korea's, not all the time, it doesn't happen, but it's going to continue to be a problem and difficult to achieve other non-proliferation and disarmament goals in that ways. That was a long answer, sorry.
Well done.
Hello, my name is Sina. I'm a researcher at Chemical Engineering Department. My question is, in your opinion, is it in the national interest of Iran's neighbors that Iran comes with a deal with the States? Is it in the national interest
great
of
question.
Dubai, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Russia, China?
Mm-hmm.
And is it important? If no?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on something that is very important. Particularly the Arab states that are across the Persian Gulf. It's fascinating to watch the kinds of pronouncements that come out. They don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons, but they also don't want the United States to bomb Iran because they're terrified that the retaliation would come and would hit them, would hit Saudi oil fields or islands in the Gulf or close the Strait of Hormuz. But they do exert an influence over the United States. It's one of the reasons why I think it's hard to reach a deal. The Israelis also, they don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons, but I don't think they necessarily want to see a good relationship between the United States and Iran because Israel's real concern about Iran, frankly, is not so much nuclear weapons. It's the groups that Iran supports that are threatening Israel much more directly, groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. It's the support that Iran gives for the militant aspects of the Palestinian cause. So it's very complicated for the United States to be able to really figure out what is in the U.S. national interest. Still, I think that, particularly in the Obama administration, they understand that for that region to ever become more stable, the U.S. and Iran need to have some basic understanding. We're getting out of Afghanistan right now. If that country is going to have any kind of future, if it's not going to become a haven for al-Qaeda again, completely fall apart, it would be helpful to have some cooperation, even if it's just tacit, with Iran, which has influence particularly in the western part of the country. Syria is turning into a failed state. Iran can play a lot of games there, even if Assad falls. They can turn up the heat on sectarian militias. They can fuel a civil war in Syria that could be very destabilizing. So there are a lot of things that we have to talk about with Iran. And I would hope that we can filter out some of the Israeli noise and some of the Saudi noise and the UAE noise and focus on what we actually can accomplish together with Iran at some point if we can get past this nuclear hiccup.
Side? Yes?
Thank you. Ali Talibinejad, I'm an MIT alumni. As you might well know, in 1950s, British and then US overthrown a democratic regime in Iran, the regime of Dr. Mossadegh. And in the heart of that issue was oil, because they wanted to get the oil. In the current situation, the regime of Iran wants to sell the oil, and the West and US don't want to buy the oil because of the nuclear issues. Along all the formal negotiation with Iran, as you know, there are a parallel track talk with Iran. Mr. Thomas Pickering, Asian Society, you and the other people. And there are a lot of connection with the oil companies. I'm not referring to you, but you can see the connections. Now, in a situation that Iran wants to sell the oil and the foreign countries don't want to buy it, because of the nuclear issues. And the Iranian regime, at some point, because it needs the money, because internal policies, is going to come and negotiate. I would like to ask, what is the place of human rights in all of these issues, knowing this violent regime in Iran, election, democracy, and so on? Specifically to you, that you have been involved in parallel tracks, directly or indirectly. How and when did you put it, and what do you think is the right place to be, and what has been done in this direction? Thank you.
Good.
Maybe let me just say one thing first. Human rights is something that I always raise with Iranian officials whenever I have an opportunity. I've raised it with Ahmadinejad many times. I raised it with Ali Larijani, who's the Speaker of the Parliament, who I met the last time I was there. I asked him, how long are you going to keep two presidential candidates under house arrest? Mehdi Karoubi and Mir Hussein Mousavi have been under house arrest now for over 2 years. These are two gentlemen who ran against Ahmadinejad in 2009. I always raise it. It's one of the reasons why I think diplomatic relations are so important, because then you can have a regular dialogue on all of these issues. You don't have to do it through the Swiss, who represent U.S. interests now. There's an Iranian-American, Amir Hekmati, has been jailed for, I think, more than 2 years. He has been in solitary confinement for most of this time, and he's allegedly a spy, but nobody has ever seen the evidence against him. If you have diplomats based in a place, they can raise these issues on a regular basis. So very important.
Yeah. I agree, too. I think Iran's human rights record is deeply troubling, and I have had opportunities to raise particular cases with members of the Iranian government and that have yielded successful outcomes. So I think it's important. Of course, my focus, I've mostly done that in a personal capacity. My scholarly focus is on nuclear weapon states, nuclear decision-making, proliferation. My own view is, and I'm not a human rights specialist, so I don't know that literature very well, but my own guess, all things being equal, Iran is more likely to have a better human rights record in a context in which it does not feel threatened than when it does feel threatened. Now, it's still going to feel threatened domestically, and how it deals with that, we'll have to wait and see. But I think if it feels both threatened from abroad and threatened at home, it's unlikely that its human rights record will improve. That's my hypothesis. So I think it should be raised. Lots of countries have human rights issues. It should be raised with those countries. The fact that there are human rights issues doesn't prevent us either from having diplomatic relations or from disagreeing on other issues, nuclear or otherwise. So I think we should try to handle it like we do. It should be on the table. It should be important to us. We have to be careful, though, that this doesn't turn into a thing where we get a settlement on the nuclear issue, and then we say, and we go and we're going to release sanctions, and then we say, well, we'd like to reduce those sanctions that we put on you over the nuclear program, but we've changed our mind about that because you do have these human rights problems. So we're going to keep them, and then when you're better in human rights, then we'll take off those sanctions. Because that's going to be incredibly tempting to do. And I know people in Congress will definitely say that. It will make a nuclear deal impossible. Right? You can't, a country can't do X, you put sanctions on them for X, they say, okay, I'll stop doing X, they stop doing X, and you keep the sanctions. That just doesn't work. So I think we need to continue to vigorously, individually or in government relationships that we don't have, continue to press human rights issues like we do with all countries that have human rights issues.
What about just having that in parallel, having that as one of the issues of removing the sanctions, as they have been done in many other countries, like South Africa?
Yeah, I think I'm sorry. My guess is in Congress right now, and I haven't looked at it, is there are sanctions on nuclear, sanctions on human rights, sanctions on religious freedom. What am I leaving out?
Oh, God, support for terrorism is a
Support for terrorism.
huge one.
So I think there's a ton of sanctions out there. I don't think introducing human rights into the P5+1 nuclear talks, which are already very difficult, is necessarily a good idea.
Blake Parker, I'm a board advisor at Amnesty MIT, and I do some non-fellow research in international security. Thank you for bringing this forum. Jim mentioned, he brought up the concept of mistrust, and there's mistrust going both ways. Just like Dr. Talabanian mentioned, the Dulles brothers' foray in 1953 overthrew democratically elected prime minister. So we really gave them a lot of reasons to mistrust us. But over the years, this thing has escalated and it's getting to a boiling point. I was very pleased when Barbara mentioned the Cyrus cylinder coming on tour. That, to me, that's like a symbol. It's the greatest symbol of human rights to me. But then it made me remember that a chief executive of the Iran Heritage Foundation, which is a sponsor of the
Sponsoring the
tour,
tour,
was
yeah.
imprisoned in the UK for stealing over £1 million worth of rare book pages and maps. And I'm not saying that he did it
I think it
because
was
of the Iran regime.
It was the
I'm
Iran
just,
Heritage Society in the U.S. which paid for the Cyrus cylinder
Oh,
to
is
come,
it?
so it has nothing to do with that.
Okay,
yeah.
But let me
I
hear your
made the-
question.
okay,
Your question.
So anyway, the question is this, basically, Iranian students, underground scientists, and academics have been telling me that we should not trust the regime. And so I'm asking you, why should we really trust that we can negotiate with them? And I'm not even concerned over the nuclear, because an MIT researcher told us at the International Security Program at Harvard a few months ago that they really could produce weapons-grade material in only a few months if they so desired. They couldn't do it without being detected, but it could be done. And he gave us the data to prove that.
We shouldn't trust them without a reason to trust them. I mean, trust but verify, as Reagan used to say. But if you start a process, if you can specify an agreement, if they live up to their agreement. I mean, all of these things are going to be suspensions. They will suspend enrichment to 20% in return for a suspension of sanctions. These things will not be irrevocably removed until you have a sense, you have a track record of implementation. The Iranians signed something called the Additional Protocol of the NPT. And for a time, they implemented it, even though it's never been ratified by their parliament. Well, as part of this process, they could actually ratify it and begin to implement it again. You need a step-by-step process. You need a roadmap to eventually removing these nuclear-related sanctions. And we judge performance, and they judge our performance, and we see whether we both implement the terms of an agreement. I don't want to refer too much to North Korea, but there's been a lot of, I mean, the record with North Korea, of course, has gone straight downhill since 2002. But for almost a decade, the North Koreans abided by much of an agreed framework that we reached with them in 1994. And the US also abided by much of it. Neither side completely fulfilled the deal with North Korea, but it did slow their nuclear program down, and there was progress made. And if George W. Bush had not been elected president, in 2000, I think that relationship would have improved. I don't think North Korea would ever have reached the stage that it's reached. Similarly, I don't think we'd be where we are with Iran today if George W. Bush hadn't put them on the axis of evil after they helped us out in Afghanistan. So the Iranians have shown goodwill at times. And unfortunately, they've not always been rewarded for showing that goodwill. So we have to reverse this downward spiral somehow.
I'm glad you asked about it, because it also shines a light on my comments about mistrust. And so I should be more precise in talking about it. First of all, countries mistrust each other, and that's probably a good thing. And then, secondly, anytime you negotiate with an adversary, they're an adversary. They have hostile intentions and, are looking to contradict your interests. So you're going to be suspicious of them. So some of this is constant and in the background and part of doing business. And so, but I guess what I would say to footnote my remarks is that this particular relationship seems to have, if we were coding it on degree of mistrust over time, this one would be, in the top echelon, top 20% of most mistrustful relationships or something, right? That it's not just normal, you're negotiating with your adversary or da-da-da. This has really gotten, everything seems to be feeding these mutual stories of regime change versus rushing for a bomb. But if it's run-of-the-mill mistrust, there are lots of examples of countries negotiating agreements and figuring out ways to verify and going in tandem, step by step.
We had arms control agreements with the Soviet Union that, were very, very important in terms of improving their relationship over time. I don't think it's impossible. It is difficult, but it's not impossible.
I wouldn't say it's impossible either. It's just, I just have to question because you still see the human rights abuses. The physics student, Omid Kokabi,
Yeah.
who was arrested, no guilt, no evidence.
I think we should be careful, though, about how we think behaviorally about the relationship between human rights and nuclear weapons behavior. I mean, it might be that they're related. That's sort of what you're positing, is that bad human rights behavior somehow also signifies something about how you're going to behave in nuclear agreements. Now, you can imagine that it would. You could also imagine that these things would be unrelated in practice, and states could be human rights abusers and still sign arms control agreements, or, I could imagine, there are 4 boxes here, and I can imagine instances in all 4 boxes. But in any case, it's certainly a hypothesis, not an empirical finding, widespread understood empirical.
I'm not ready to write a paper yet, but I am doing research.
Did you have a question, ma'am?
Seems too tall. Barbara, I'm so excited about the cultural exchange program that you described. And I'm Nancy Wren, and I'm with Mass Peace Action. And we're a grassroots organization and trying to think of ways that we can articulate the Iran situation, not in the usual blips that come on the press with the nuclear debate, but more in terms of a human face on the Iranian people. We've been working a little bit with the Iranian American group in Washington.
National Iranian American Council?
Thank you. I think that
NIAC.
might be. Yeah, thank you. And they gave us the idea that they're collecting or about to collect medical supplies and medicines. And I think that would catch people's imagination in a way that maybe we haven't seen in the press. And sanctions are such a pivot here in our discussion today and also for the country.
I'm really glad you mentioned that.
Let me interrupt 1 second.
Sure.
So we're at the witching hour here. So we'll take that question. Well, since you were standing up, we'll take your question now, assuming it's succinct, and therefore would be an aberration. Yes.
Yavor, climate physics grad student at MIT. So Iran has been linked to some armed groups in the region. Can these armed groups at some point turn against the will of the Iranian government and intentionally sabotage any negotiations?
Great
just
question.
To keep
Okay,
Iran?
we have a question about medical supplies and greater person-to-person contact and putting a human face. People to people.
Let me take that because, as I mentioned, there's a report coming out from the Atlantic Council, acus.org, hopefully in a couple of weeks, that specifically addresses this. The sanctions, the banking sanctions, have resulted in a drastic decrease in medical supplies going into Iran because it's disrupted all their normal patterns of importing particularly from European pharmaceutical companies that will no longer do business with Iran. It's been very, very difficult. People who are suffering from cancer, who have conditions like hemophilia, are really suffering. And it is very important that we fix this problem with the sanctions, and there is a way to do it so that companies will no longer have to worry about how they will get paid for sending materials there. But I also think it's a great gesture that NIAC wants to organize donations of medical supplies to send, because the last thing we want to do with Iran is go down the route that we did with Iraq, where our sanctions caused widespread, massive suffering on the part of ordinary people, turned the population against us more than against their own regime, and destroyed the basis for a relationship in the future. I mean, if you poll Iraqis now, they certainly don't like us very much. And the sanctions, of course, were a prelude to war in Iraq's case. So we want to avoid that as much as possible. And to the extent we can, focus the sanctions on the Iranian leadership, people who we believe are involved with the nuclear program, rather than ordinary people.
There's a really interesting question there, the last one, about the relationship between a state and the non-state actors it funds, and if it cuts off relationships, how do they respond? You can imagine that there might be, the main 2 groups that people complain about with Iran are Hezbollah and Hamas. I don't know if Hamas can really do anything. Certainly, if you look at the history of it, you look at the PLO in Jordan, that was really nasty, when that breakup. But in the main, states are states and non-state actors are weaker. So you can imagine theoretically that a non-state actor could be problematic, but it's not. It's not a state. It doesn't have an army. It doesn't have a lot of money.
Well, we've seen hedging behavior already. I mean, Hamas moved its headquarters out of Damascus, and Hamas is now much closer to the Egyptian government, to the Muslim Brotherhood from which it sprung, than it is to Iran. It still takes weapons from Iran when it can get it. But I wouldn't say that Hamas policies are being dictated at all by Iran. In the case of Hezbollah, it's more complicated. This is an organization that was essentially founded by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in the early 1980s in Lebanon. And this is the most intimate relationship Iran has with a foreign actor. So that one is going to be very tricky. But if Syria, if the Assad regime falls, that's going to weaken that link. And Hezbollah perhaps will act more as an internal Lebanese actor and less as a
They're certainly going to be domestically preoccupied.
less as a proxy of Iran going forward.
So, but I don't think, it could be a problem, but I don't see it being a huge problem. Thank you all. Thank you for your wonderful questions.